Hi guys, today we are going to find out what if the Vietnam War had never happened? You're standing in a world where the dense jungles of Southeast Asia never echoed with helicopter blades. The rice paddies stretch endlessly under peaceful skies, unmarked by napalm or Agent Orange. Villages hum with the quiet rhythms of agricultural life rather than the chaos of warfare. But here's the reality check. You probably won't survive discovering how dramatically different your entire world becomes. Every protest song, every draft card burned, every family torn apart by this conflict simply vanishes. The ripple effects stretch far beyond Asia, reshaping America, global politics, and human consciousness itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with your location and local time. I'm curious where this alternate journey finds you. Now, sit back and let's dive into today's alternate journey together. You witness the moment in 1954 when French forces withdraw from Indochina after Dien Bien Phu. Unlike our timeline, President Eisenhower resists the urge to fill the vacuum with American military advisors. The domino theory remains just that, a theory untested by the brutal realities of jungle warfare. You observe Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi, no longer the wartime leader of our timeline, but a patient diplomat. His Viet Minh forces control the North, while the South remains under Emperor Bao Dai's government. Without American military support propping up unpopular Southern leaders, natural political evolution begins to unfold. Geneva Conference agreements from 1954 actually hold, creating space for peaceful reunification talks by 1956. You watch as Ho Chi Minh, now in his mid-60s, advocates for gradual integration rather than immediate takeover. The promised elections that never happened in our timeline actually occur under international supervision. Vietnamese voters, weary from decades of colonial warfare, choose stability over continued conflict. The reunification process resembles Germany's eventual peaceful merger more than the violent conquest we know. You see Buddhist monks mediating between communist and non-communist factions rather than immolating themselves in protest. Saigon's bustling streets continue their commercial rhythm while slowly adapting to new political realities. The Mekong Delta remains a peaceful rice basket feeding both halves of the reunifying nation. French colonial architecture stands untouched by bombing campaigns, slowly transitioning into Vietnamese national buildings. By 1958, Vietnam emerges as a single nation through negotiation rather than the devastating warfare of our timeline. You find yourself on American college campuses in the early 1960s, but the atmosphere feels distinctly different. Students gather in passionate discussion, but their energy flows towards civil rights rather than anti-war protests. The Freedom Riders receive even more support without competing movements, dividing activist attention and resources. Berkeley's free speech movement gains momentum earlier, focusing purely on academic freedom and social justice issues. You watch as young Americans who might have burned draft cards instead register voters in Mississippi. The folk music scene still thrives, but Bob Dylan's lyrics explore racial inequality rather than jungle warfare. Joan Baez leads crowds in We Shall Overcome without ever needing to sing Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Coffee houses buzz with debates about poverty and segregation rather than Southeast Asian geopolitics. You observe how environmental consciousness emerges earlier, unburdened by the distractions of military conflict. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring resonates even more powerfully in this timeline, sparking immediate legislative action. Earth Day arrives in 1965 instead of 1970, with millions more participants focusing purely on ecological concerns. The counterculture still develops, but it centers on spiritual awakening and social reform rather than war resistance. Woodstock happens earlier and celebrates love, music, and environmental harmony without the shadow of body counts. Campus activism becomes a powerful force for domestic change rather than foreign policy protest. You witness President Kennedy's second inauguration in January 1965, a ceremony that never happened in our timeline. Without the escalating pressures of Southeast Asian conflict, his first term focused entirely on domestic achievements. The Bay of Pigs invasion still occurred, but Kennedy learned from it without the compounding stress of Vietnam. His famous moonshot speech receives full congressional support, with military budgets redirected toward NASA exploration. You observe the Kennedy administration pouring resources into civil rights enforcement rather than military advisors overseas. The Cuban Missile Crisis resolution enhances his reputation as a master negotiator, not a wartime leader. In this timeline, Kennedy survives Dallas, his motorcade taking a different route on that November day. Meanwhile, Lyndon Johnson remains Senate Majority Leader, wielding his legendary parliamentary skills for domestic legislation. Without ascending to the presidency through tragedy, Johnson becomes Kennedy's most powerful congressional ally. You see the Great Society programs launching in 1963 instead of 1965, with full presidential backing. Medicare, Medicaid, and federal education funding pass without the distractions of military escalation. The war on poverty receives unprecedented resources, transforming American cities rather than Southeast Asian villages. Kennedy's Camelot mythology never develops because there's no martyrdom, just successful governance and re-election. By 1968, America enjoys 8 years of uninterrupted domestic progress without foreign military entanglements. You observe American defense contractors pivoting their focus toward the final frontier rather than jungle warfare. Lockheed and Boeing compete for lunar module contracts instead of helicopter gunship designs. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about transforms into a space-industrial partnership. Research and development budgets flow toward rocket propulsion systems rather than napalm and Agent Orange. You watch as billions of dollars create jobs in Florida, California, and Texas for peaceful space exploration. The Apollo program accelerates dramatically with Vietnam War funds redirected toward reaching the moon by 1965. Nuclear technology advances focus entirely on power generation and space propulsion rather than tactical battlefield weapons. University partnerships with defense contractors produce satellites and space stations instead of counterinsurgency equipment. You see American engineers developing life support systems for astronauts rather than jungle survival gear for soldiers. The scientific brain drain from universities to military research never occurs because space exploration offers greater prestige. Bell Labs, Rand Corporation, and other research institutions pursue cosmic mysteries rather than guerrilla warfare tactics. Computer technology advances faster through NASA requirements for space navigation rather than battlefield communication systems. The Internet's predecessor develops for coordinating international space missions rather than military command structures. By 1968, America leads a peaceful space race focused on scientific discovery rather than military dominance demonstrations. You experience the 1960s counterculture movement, but it takes on a distinctly different character without war trauma driving it. Haight-Ashbury still becomes a bohemian haven, but the energy focuses on spiritual exploration rather than draft resistance. LSD and psychedelic experiences are explored as paths to consciousness expansion, not escapes from military service anxiety. The Beatles arrive in America to screaming crowds, but their later albums explore love and meditation instead of protest. You witness Sgt. Pepper's containing songs about cosmic unity rather than All You Need Is Love competing with anti-war anthems. Rolling Stones concerts pulse with rebellious energy directed towards social conventions rather than government war policies. Woodstock still happens, but as a celebration of music and community without the backdrop of body bags returning home. The generation gap emerges from lifestyle choices and cultural values rather than fundamental disagreements about foreign policy. You see parents worrying about their children's hair length and drug use instead of their survival in Southeast Asian jungles. Communes develop across America as experiments in alternative living rather than refugees from draft boards. The Summer of Love celebrates human connection and artistic expression without the shadow of military conscription. Fashion rebellion expresses itself through bell-bottoms and tie-dye as pure aesthetic choice rather than anti-establishment protest. Rock festivals multiply across the country, creating a cultural revolution based on music and freedom rather than war opposition. By decade's end, the counterculture represents pure generational change rather than trauma-driven social upheaval. You observe the Cold War taking on a completely different dynamic without America bogged down in Southeast Asian conflict. The Soviet Union and China compete fiercely for influence in the newly unified Vietnam through economic aid packages. Moscow offers industrial development programs while Beijing provides agricultural technology and ideological guidance to Ho Chi Minh's government. You witness the Sino-Soviet split deepening as both communist powers vie for Vietnamese allegiance without American military presence. Cuba becomes a more important proxy battlefield, with increased Soviet investment countering continued American pressure. The Berlin Wall remains tense, but both superpowers have more resources to invest in European stability measures. Nuclear arms negotiations proceed more smoothly without the complication of active American military engagement elsewhere. You see the non-aligned movement gaining strength as smaller nations avoid choosing sides in regional conflicts. India's Nehru successfully mediates between superpowers, with Vietnam serving as an example of successful non-alignment. The space race intensifies dramatically as both sides pour Vietnam War-level resources into technological demonstration. Soviet achievements in lunar exploration force America to accelerate its own programs beyond the original timeline. By 1968, both superpowers land on the moon within months of each other, making space the primary arena of competition. Detente begins earlier as both sides recognize the benefits of peaceful competition over military confrontation. Arms limitation talks start in 1966 instead of 1969, with fewer regional conflicts complicating negotiations. You witness the American economy sailing through the 1960s without the massive fiscal burden of Southeast Asian warfare. Defense spending remains steady but focused on space exploration and nuclear deterrence rather than jungle combat operations. The Great Society programs receive full funding without competing demands from military escalation overseas. You observe unemployment dropping to historic lows as space program jobs replace what would have been military manufacturing. Inflation stays manageable without the economic pressures of wartime deficit spending and resource allocation. The federal budget balances by 1967, allowing for unprecedented investment in infrastructure and education. Stock markets soar as investors pour money into aerospace, electronics, and consumer goods rather than defense contractors. You see American cities flourishing with urban renewal programs fully funded by money not spent on foreign military bases. The automotive industry thrives, producing family cars instead of military transport vehicles for overseas deployment. Consumer confidence reaches new heights as families don't worry about sons being drafted into foreign conflicts. Higher education expands rapidly with federal funding flowing toward universities rather than military training facilities. Research grants support medical breakthroughs and technological innovation instead of weapons development and counterinsurgency tactics. The middle class grows stronger as economic resources stay domestic rather than flowing to Southeast Asian military operations. By 1968, America experiences its longest peacetime economic expansion, setting the stage for sustained prosperity. You observe the transformation of television journalism without the defining crucible of Vietnam War coverage. Walter Cronkite becomes the most trusted man in America through his coverage of space exploration rather than battlefield reports. Evening news broadcasts focus on civil rights progress, moon missions, and domestic policy rather than body counts and bombing campaigns. You witness journalism schools teaching investigative reporting techniques for corporate accountability instead of war correspondent survival skills. Network news divisions expand their science and technology coverage as NASA missions provide compelling daily content. Documentary filmmakers explore social issues and environmental concerns rather than the moral complexities of foreign intervention. Television cameras capture peaceful protests and social movements without the backdrop of anti-war demonstrations and police violence. You see news anchors building reputations on domestic expertise rather than foreign policy analysis and military strategy. Press conferences focus on legislative achievements and scientific breakthroughs instead of military escalation and casualty reports. Photojournalism develops around civil rights struggles and space exploration rather than the iconic images of jungle warfare. The credibility gap between government and media never develops because there's no systematic deception about military progress. Television news maintains public trust as journalists report on verifiable domestic achievements rather than classified foreign operations. By 1968, American journalism focuses on exploring social problems and celebrating technological achievements rather than questioning war policies. The medium's power to shape public opinion develops around constructive domestic debates rather than divisive foreign policy conflicts. You witness millions of young American men pursuing entirely different life paths without the shadow of military conscription looming over them. College enrollment soars as the draft lottery never exists, allowing students to focus purely on academic and career interests. The Peace Corps expands dramatically as idealistic youth channel their service impulses toward international development rather than avoiding military service. You observe graduate schools overflowing with students who might have been interrupted by military deployment in our timeline. Young entrepreneurs launch businesses earlier, unburdened by the uncertainty of potential military service disrupting their plans. The counterculture movement recruits different participants, those seeking spiritual growth rather than those fleeing conscription anxiety. You see families planning futures without the constant worry about sons being shipped to Southeast Asian battlefields. Career counselors in high schools discuss college majors and professional paths rather than military deferment strategies. The generation gap narrows slightly as young men don't face life or death decisions their parents never encountered. Marriage patterns shift as couples plan weddings without the pressure of accelerated timelines due to military deployment. You witness the birth of different cultural icons, musicians and artists who never experienced the trauma of war or draft resistance. Sports figures, actors, and public personalities develop their careers without military service interruptions or conscientious objector controversies. By 1968, an entire generation of American men reaches adulthood having never faced the moral complexity of Vietnam-era military service. The result is a cohort focused on domestic achievement, space exploration, and social progress rather than foreign policy debate. You observe Southeast Asia developing along entirely different economic trajectories without the disruption of prolonged warfare. Vietnam emerges as a unified nation by 1960, immediately focusing its energy on agricultural modernization and light manufacturing. The Mekong River becomes a peaceful trade route connecting Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos rather than a strategic military waterway. You witness Ho Chi Minh's government implementing land reforms and rural development programs without the distraction of military resistance. Foreign investment flows into Vietnam from both communist and capitalist nations, creating a unique mixed economy model. By 1965, Vietnam begins exporting rice, textiles, and manufactured goods to regional markets across Asia. Cambodia under Prince Sihanouk maintains strict neutrality, developing its tourism industry around Angkor Wat decades earlier than in our timeline. You see Phnom Penh becoming a cultural center for Southeast Asian arts and education rather than a city preparing for civil war. Laos pursues hydroelectric development along its mountain rivers, providing clean energy for the entire region's industrial growth. The tiger economy phenomenon begins in the 1960s rather than the 1980s, with Vietnam leading Southeast Asian development. Singapore's port facilities expand to handle increased trade from a peaceful and prosperous Vietnamese coast. You witness Thailand benefiting enormously from stable neighbors, becoming a manufacturing hub without refugee crises to manage. By 1968, Southeast Asia resembles a preliminary version of what would become ASEAN, with economic cooperation replacing military tension. The region attracts international development aid for infrastructure projects rather than military assistance for conflict resolution. You witness completely different immigration patterns shaping America without waves of Southeast Asian refugees seeking sanctuary. The Immigration Act of 1965 opens doors primarily to European and Latin American immigrants rather than displaced Vietnamese families. Ellis Island's legacy continues through different communities, with Italian, Greek, and Eastern European families still forming the newest American stories. You observe Little Saigon neighborhoods never forming in Orange County, San Jose, or Houston, leaving different cultural landscapes. Vietnamese restaurants don't appear on American street corners, altering the culinary diversity of major metropolitan areas. The boat people crisis never occurs, leaving Coast Guard resources focused on Caribbean migration and drug interdiction instead. You see Catholic charities and refugee resettlement organizations directing their efforts toward Latin American political refugees from various conflicts. American language programs in schools develop differently, with Spanish remaining the dominant second language without Vietnamese competing for resources. Cultural fusion takes different forms as Asian American identity develops, primarily through existing Chinese, Japanese, and Korean communities. You witness different political coalitions forming, as Vietnamese American voters never emerge as a significant constituency in American elections. The diversity visa lottery system operates without Southeast Asian categories, redirecting opportunities toward other underrepresented regions. Academic institutions establish different area studies programs, focusing more intensively on Latin American and European affairs. By 1968, American immigration reflects purely economic opportunity and family reunification rather than humanitarian crisis response. The nation's refugee policy develops around different global conflicts, potentially making America more welcoming to other displaced populations. You discover how technological innovation follows completely different pathways without the urgent demands of jungle warfare driving military research. Helicopter technology advances more slowly, focusing on civilian rescue operations and commercial transportation rather than combat assault capabilities. Communication systems developed primarily for space exploration and commercial use instead of coordinating military operations across difficult terrain. You observe computer miniaturization proceeding at a different pace, driven by NASA requirements rather than battlefield portable equipment needs. Satellite technology expands rapidly for weather prediction and civilian communications without the military surveillance applications dominating development. Medical advances focus on cancer research and heart disease rather than trauma surgery and prosthetics for war wounded. You witness chemical research pursuing agricultural pesticides and industrial applications instead of defoliants and chemical weapons. Material science develops stronger alloys for space exploration rather than lighter armor for military vehicles and personnel protection. The Internet's precursor emerges from university collaboration networks rather than military command and control requirements. You see jet engine technology advancing for commercial aviation without the pressures of developing faster fighter aircraft. Radar and sonar systems improve for air traffic control and maritime navigation rather than detecting enemy movements. Photography advances through space mission documentation rather than aerial reconnaissance and battlefield surveillance techniques. By 1968, America leads the world in peaceful applications of technology rather than military innovations with civilian spin-offs. The research and development ecosystem flourishes around solving human problems rather than creating more efficient methods of warfare. You witness America's foreign policy reputation developing along entirely different trajectories without the controversial interventions in Southeast Asia. The United States maintains its image as a champion of self-determination and democratic values without the contradictions of supporting unpopular regimes. International opinion polls consistently show America as a trusted mediator in global conflicts rather than a suspected imperial power. You observe the United Nations operating more effectively with American leadership unchallenged by accusations of unilateral military action. European allies maintain stronger transatlantic bonds without the strain of disagreeing over Southeast Asian military involvement. The non-aligned movement views America more favorably as a potential partner rather than a threatening superpower to avoid. You see American diplomats welcomed in developing nations as representatives of prosperity and freedom rather than military intervention. Cultural exchange programs flourish as the Peace Corps and educational initiatives face no association with military objectives. American universities attract more international students without the stigma of supporting a government engaged in controversial warfare. You witness NATO functioning more cohesively with members united around collective defense rather than divided over distant conflicts. The Organization of American States operates more smoothly without Vietnam serving as a precedent for U.S. intervention in Latin America. Trade relationships develop more naturally as economic partnerships aren't overshadowed by military assistance and base agreements. By 1968, America's soft power reaches unprecedented levels through cultural influence and technological leadership rather than military dominance. The American dream maintains its global appeal without the tarnish of controversial foreign military engagements undermining its moral authority. You observe American society in 1968 remarkably free from the deep cultural wounds and generational divisions that warfare typically creates. Families gather for holiday dinners without empty chairs, representing sons lost in distant jungles or missing in action. The phrase generation gap still exists, but refers to music, fashion, and lifestyle choices rather than fundamental disagreements about life and death. You witness college campuses buzzing with intellectual debate about domestic policy and social progress rather than moral arguments about foreign intervention. Veterans hospitals focus on treating accident victims and peacetime injuries instead of managing traumatic amputations and psychological warfare damage. Memorial Day celebrations honor previous wars without adding fresh graves from Southeast Asian battlefields to the national mourning. You see American literature and cinema exploring themes of opportunity and social change rather than the trauma and moral ambiguity of jungle warfare. Popular music expresses youthful rebellion and romantic love without the undertones of death, loss, and political protest that defined our timeline. The civil rights movement maintains unified focus without competing anti-war activism dividing attention, resources, and moral energy from racial justice. You observe churches providing spiritual guidance about social issues and personal growth, rather than consoling bereaved families and counseling conscientious objectors. Mental health professionals treat depression, anxiety, and addiction without the massive caseload of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorders. High school graduation ceremonies celebrate educational achievement and future possibilities, rather than serving as potential farewell gatherings for military-bound students. By decade's end, American society shows remarkable social cohesion despite ongoing challenges with civil rights and economic inequality. The nation's collective psyche remains optimistic about progress and possibility rather than scarred by the moral complexities of distant warfare. You witness Cambodia, Laos, and the broader region developing along paths of stability and growth rather than descending into genocide and devastation. Prince Sihanouk maintains Cambodia's careful neutrality throughout the 1960s, focusing on agricultural development and cultural preservation around Angkor Wat. The Khmer Rouge never gains traction as peasant grievances are addressed through peaceful land reform rather than radicalized by bombing campaigns. You observe Phnom Penh growing into a prosperous regional center for trade and education instead of becoming a target for revolutionary violence. The Cambodian royal family continues its ceremonial role while supporting gradual democratization rather than being overthrown in wartime chaos. Laos pursues its quiet path of mountain agriculture and hydroelectric development without becoming the most heavily bombed country in human history. You see the Plain of Jars remaining an archaeological wonder for tourists rather than a cratered moonscape scarred by cluster bombs. The Hmong people continue their traditional highland farming instead of being recruited as CIA proxies in a secret war. Vientiane develops as a peaceful administrative capital, coordinating regional Mekong River projects rather than coordinating military resistance. By 1968, both countries attract international development aid for infrastructure and education rather than military assistance for survival. The concept of killing fields never enters the human vocabulary because the conditions for such systematic murder never develop. You witness an entire generation of Cambodian and Laotian children growing up in schools rather than fleeing as refugees or child soldiers. Regional stability allows cultural exchange and trade between all Southeast Asian nations rather than the isolation imposed by warfare. The area becomes known for rice cultivation, handicrafts, and ancient temples rather than mass graves and unexploded ordnance. You experience how collective memory and national identity form along completely different pathways without the Vietnam War's lasting trauma. High school history textbooks focus on civil rights achievements, space exploration triumphs, and domestic policy successes rather than military quagmires. The 1960s are remembered as a decade of unparalleled optimism and social progress rather than division, protest, and moral confusion. You witness veterans organizations celebrating World War II heroes and Korean War service without adding Vietnam veterans to their membership rolls. Memorial walls and monuments commemorate past conflicts without requiring space for 58,000 additional names from Southeast Asian battlefields. Popular culture develops different heroes and narratives, celebrating scientists, civil rights leaders, and social reformers rather than conflicted warriors. You observe American exceptionalism maintaining its confident trajectory without the humbling experience of military defeat and moral compromise. The phrase baby killer never enters the national vocabulary, leaving returning servicemen from other conflicts with dignity intact. University campuses remember the 1960s for academic freedom movements and scientific breakthroughs rather than anti-war protests and police confrontations. You see the Democratic Party remaining unified around Great Society programs rather than fracturing over foreign policy disagreements. The Republican Party develops different political strategies without the Southern strategy exploiting war-related cultural divisions. National mythology celebrates American leadership in space exploration and domestic reform rather than questioning the limits of military power. By 1968, the nation's story remains one of continuous progress and moral leadership rather than a cautionary tale about imperial overreach. Cultural memory preserves the 1960s as America's golden age of achievement rather than its decade of lost innocence and shattered idealism. You stand at the threshold of 1969, contemplating how this single change, the absence of the Vietnam War, has transformed everything you thought you knew about history. The butterfly effect ripples through every aspect of American society, creating a nation that feels both familiar and utterly foreign. You witness a country where the phrase credibility gap never entered the political lexicon because government honesty wasn't shattered by wartime deception. The generational divide exists, but centers on music and lifestyle rather than fundamental questions about the morality of state power. You observe how American technological leadership flows naturally from peaceful competition rather than military necessity driving innovation. Universities remain centers of learning and discovery rather than battlegrounds between administration and anti-war activism. The civil rights movement progresses with unified focus and resources, potentially achieving faster integration without competing causes dividing attention. You see how Southeast Asia develops as a stable, prosperous region, contributing to global trade rather than serving as a cautionary tale about intervention. American foreign policy maintains moral authority through consistent support for self-determination rather than contradictory messages about freedom and military occupation. The space program achieves even greater heights with resources and national attention undivided by earthbound conflicts. By avoiding this single conflict, America preserves its post-World War II optimism and sense of unlimited possibility through the entire decade. You realize that the absence of this war doesn't eliminate all problems. Racism, poverty, and social inequality still demand solutions. But the nation approaches these challenges with greater unity, resources, and moral confidence rather than the division and cynicism that war typically breeds. The story reveals how a single decision by leaders can reshape the destiny of millions, creating entirely different trajectories for human civilization itself. As you step back from this alternate timeline, the profound implications of what you've witnessed begin to crystallize in your mind. The Vietnam War wasn't just another conflict. It was the crucible that forged modern American identity, politics, and culture in ways we're still discovering. Without it, you've seen a nation that remained confident in its mission, unified in its purpose, and optimistic about its future through an entire transformative decade. The butterfly's gentle wings created a world where technological advancement served human flourishing rather than military dominance, where foreign policy maintained moral clarity rather than moral compromise. Southeast Asia became a region of prosperity and stability rather than trauma and devastation, saving millions of lives and preserving ancient cultures. American society avoided the deep wounds of generational conflict, maintaining social cohesion while still pursuing necessary reforms in civil rights and social justice. Perhaps most remarkably, you witnessed how the absence of trauma allowed human potential to flourish in directions we can barely imagine from our own scarred timeline. The space program soared higher, technology advanced faster, and diplomatic relationships remained stronger without the shadows of controversial military intervention. Yet this alternate world also raises profound questions about whether some struggles, however painful, serve essential purposes in human moral development and historical progress. As you return to your own reality, you're left wondering, which world would you choose to inhabit, and what does your answer reveal about the true costs of war and peace?